Hola, 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 ¿cómo están? ¿Cómo están?
Hola.
Estamos muy ocupados últimamente, ¿no, Hein? We are really busy these days.
I understood.
Ah, ella entiende, Hein ya entiende. ¿Saben por qué? Porque se va a examinar del B1 de español en Corea, en el Instituto Cervantes, dentro de muy poco, y ha estudiado muchísimo. O sea, yo ahora mismo coreano soy un pringado comparado con ella español, literal.
Pringles?
No, pringado, like I'm so bad in Korean compared to you in Spanish right now. Hoy vamos a hacer un vídeo sobre el trabajo en Corea. Ahora mismo Hein está buscando trabajo por allí por Corea y un montón de cosas que me ha comentado me han parecido curiosas. Sin más paranoia, tengo un par de preguntas pendientes para decirle a Hein y hablar aquí un ratito nosotros. ¿Empezamos o qué? Is it easy to find a work in Korea?
No. It's really hard.
All kind of jobs, or there are jobs that are easy to find?
I don't know. I can say easy or not, but IT가 뭐지?
IT, you mean? Technology.
IT, technology. Coding 알아? Do you know coding?
Yeah, coding. Programación,
coding
sí.
is really like hot here.
Hmm.
It is like much more, I heard, easier to find a job.
Our subscribers, I feel like a big percent they do coding. I don't know why, but
Really?
because
아니, how?
because
How do you know?
because most of the people that came to our Patreon, por cierto, estamos en Patreon, nos pueden apoyar para, yo qué sé, para todas estas cositas que vamos a hacer en el futuro cuando vaya a Corea y esas cositas, música, usted me entiende. The people from Patreon, most of them study technology, like coding and all these kind of things.
Programming.
Do you think for foreigners it's a good way to find a work in Korea? Like also the programming, right? Maybe.
Yeah, because like it doesn't need too much talk in like Korean or something. It doesn't
because
need
programming you have to know. Yeah, you have to know Java, you have to know C++ or whatever thing. Java or whatever.
Java. We call Java.
Like you, yeah, that's the good thing. You don't have to completely learn Korean, but I mean, you should maybe if you want to be in Korea, for sure. And do you think for Koreans, they think when foreigners take their jobs, they don't like it, right? Much. Don't like that foreigners take the jobs in Korea, or what? They don't care.
No.
I don't know. There was a question, I think, in Instagram about that.
No.
Okay.
If foreigner and we have same ability, for sure Korean company hire us. Because we can speak Korean.
Los dos en la palma perdiendo el control, sin nada que nos deje olvidar. I don't wanna miss a thing no more. Si tú quieres ir ahí yo voy.